There have been some questions about the online program, and I'll do a little bit of some stuff with that to show you how it works with this case, and then we'll do the interpretation. Okay, so basically, this case has already been input, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit those responses. So what's going to happen is that the standard scores and sets will be slightly different on the screen than you'll have, but you'll be able to see how much it changes things. Yeah. And so and we'll be able to take a look at that. So there are two ways to edit the responses. There's a thing called tables, and so this sheet is basically the first sheet that we looked at yesterday. It's the left to right thing, right? And it's the same order and so forth. What you'll see here is that for human movement we have HM, and for animal movement we have AM. And for inanimate movement we have IM on this table. It just works in terms of the computer system to keep all those very different and not work. We don't want to work with lowercase and uppercase stuff in inner workings of the system. So sometimes it comes up like this, and just know that. Okay? And so the first change we wanted to make was over here on, we wanted to get rid of this income. That was the first change. And you see it's pretty easy. It comes up all at once. It's a little easier than some of the older RIAP systems. We get rid of this aggression content. And this H parens we're making pure H because they say it's a person, right, with wings. Okay? Now, and so I'm going to say, there's other changes we need to do, but I'm going to save the responses and show you just the other way to do it. So when you're using those tables, that you have to remember the variable names in your head and type those out. And it's good to have that first sheet out when you're doing it because everything is listed there. There's another way to do it, and it's actually a little bit easier, and it works pretty well. I typically use it more often. And this is just that form itself. This is the same form that you saw on the first day. And so what this is response number 22, the scores for it. Okay, and so if we go up here and we want to jump to response 13, so then it's going to have the response 13, and it's missing a pair, and so we just click that, and we have that. Okay, I use this screen rather than typing it in. It has everything there, and you don't have to have recognition memory and try to remember exactly what the wording is and so forth. If you're missing something, let's say that if you don't have a content, it'll have like a red mark over there for things that you need to do, and they'll be up here too. Well, I'm sorry. Up there there'll be a red mark too, or down here if there's mistakes.
Does it give you any prompts like the way RIAP does if you make a coding error based on entry?
The answer to that is I don't know yet, but we identified all those. We went through and we created a code for that. I'm not sure if they've installed it all. Okay. Let me see if I'm afraid to mess this up. But yeah, so we developed that stuff. And I think it's coded in there. So, can somebody think of one off the top of their head that we could?
Yeah, human movement with only animal content. It'll ask for confound.
Let's see here. Didn't do. Oh. No. So we don't have the same ones in there necessarily. If they're not in there, they're on the programmer's list because we just finished that about 2 or 3 months ago. So, sorry about that. If anybody has that, I tell you what, if it comes up when you're putting something, email me, then I'll email it to everybody else. Yes, we've got it in there already. Sorry about that. Okay, so we save responses, exit from this screen, and I put in that pair, right?
Yeah.
And then, oh, so I exited from the screen. I didn't do that. I just could have saved it. Could have just gone to the next response there. So it goes back to this screen. Add a response using point and click. So go to response. Let's make sure it's in there for 13. Yeah, we have the pair there. We go to 15. And so we put a pair there because I didn't remember. And then for 17, we changed that to CF, right? Mm-hmm. And we could save the responses and action. That's the only changes?
There's twos, a couple of pairs.
So we just did those.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. And nothing else after that, right? That's actually kind of comforting for me. Like my experience was, oh my God, I really screwed that up, and there were 4 of them. So, standing up in front of people with this kind of mistakes. So this, I think. Okay, now let's go ahead and look at the results. And so it's starting to come out here. Okay. So, you know, like if we go down the record that in this sort of this scan thing at first, looking at the reds and the blacks, we see the complexity score is pretty high, the blend score is pretty high, that MC minus potentially problematic determinants is quite high, and human movement is quite high. So basically, whatever those concepts might be related to, they're going to have more of an impact on our understanding of the individual.
So remind me what was into the complexity.
So the complexity, I think the best way to understand it is to say, like, the simplest responses are D, vague, pure F, animal. The most complex responses would be WS plus, three determinant blend, and 3 contents. And so the first one of those gets 0 points, the second one gets 9 points, and then you add that up for all 20-some or 30-some responses. And I think that's probably the quickest way to understand it. And she has a lot of complexity. Remember that mean was like 75 or whatever, and this is 110. And you experienced that during when we went through the record and the coding and so forth. So that's going to be a big part of the picture with her. That we've got a little bit of a problem in that the EII is elevated. Okay, so there's going to be some disturbance that we're going to have to understand, and some problems in processing. She's got a lot of little m and morbid responses. There's 2 red dots here. A lot of whole human, which is a good thing, right here. And critical contents, a large number of critical contents. Some H is high. That's consistent with what we talked about before. And you're just sort of making mental notes about what those things and what they're related to, and we'll come back to that. But there's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of human movement, so there's a lot of ideation. There's some disturbance or whatever with the ego impairment index. There's a lot of human content and a lot of thinking about people, and there's critical content, so there's a lot of disturbing, upsetting, crude sorts of contents that can disrupt concentration and processing, and we come back to more summation. So those are the things that are going to be sort of the initial primary issues that we're concerned about. And so that'd be like a quick scan process that kind of orients you. So if we go back, let's go about a little bit more carefully here. Now, let's remember that given the referral questions and referring for therapy, that so there's depression, eating disorder stuff, substance abuse. This is not an ideal situation. It's a troubled character, a troubled person who's got a lot of distress and a lot of upset. Okay? Generally, complexity is really a positive, is globally related to adaptation. The more complexity, the better adaptation. By the fact that it's more sophisticated, more differentiated, more complex cognition, more effort, more output. On the other hand, in problematic situations or troubled individuals, it can have, like, there's too much complexity, that the processes are overburdened, there's rumination, and that's not very effective. If you remember in the comprehensive system, and Exner is one of the only people that really developed this well, I think, is the idea of the economy principle. Some things should be simple and habitual and should be crystallized intelligence, crystallized processing, where they're overburdened rumination, like you get in ruminative obsessive or depressive cases. And so the complexity here could very well be problematic, overburdened, overladen, ruminative, preoccupation stuff that's not as effective. There's a capacity to process and problem solve in a complex sort of way, but it may be going awry with this individual. So you see this sort of stuff in the sort of identity disordered 27-year-old master's students who's not quite finishing school, not getting into relationships, and they show up at these college counseling situations. I'm not sure if you've come across that. You get a lot of those in workshops sometimes, because that's what the professors run into. So, anyway, so that might be this kind of case, and I think she was stumbling. They have the intellectual horsepower, and they got all this other stuff going on. That's a possibility, and we don't quite know. Looking at the complexity itself, when it's going to be positive or when it's going to be negative. Generally, we think it's positive. And it's certainly, even in this case, there's capacities. Okay. So the number of responses isn't very high, but the complexity is, so that means that each response is pretty complex, not just the overall productivity. Her values or ideas might be quality, not quantity, kind of stuff, and possibly that, but that's not that crucial or key of a sort of interpretation. Blends are high, as you would think, and form percentage, which is the percentage of pure F. Lambda is very low, 0.22. And Exner would be talking about this could be problematic. There's too much going on. Everything's a hassle. Everything is complicated. So if you had to do, if everything was novel to you all day and you had to think all about it, you'd be absolutely exhausted. This is an extraordinary number of MC, of human movement and weighted sum of color, 17. And on the one hand, that suggests a lot of adaptive capacity and potential. And human movement in particular, it can be quite adaptive, and she has a lot of that going on. But what we're seeing is an over-ideational, too much cognitive processing. There might be a lot of, at the expense of maybe a more practical sort of approach. She has a lot of color responses too. So, and now you had 4 to 7, and I had 5 to 7. Now, how much does that change? What do you have for this percentile or standard score?
110.
So it's 110 rather than 111? So this number here, what is that for you?
Oh, that one.
103.
103. So that's a little bit of a jump. So that one score. Okay? And I might have underinterpreted that. I think it is a CF. And so these are sort of strong reactions to the world, to stimulation. Emotions and reactions and responses might get the best of her. Okay? get sort of like she doesn't control those reactions very well. They may be emotional, positive, or negative. So now that there is, like, for these, we call these scores dichotomous difference scores. So dichotomous difference scores. And those scores in particular, when you have a scoring issue, they can change relatively rapidly, like this one, because you go from one side to the other when there's not a lot of variables. I'm surprised it's that big. I didn't expect it to be. But I think it is a CM. So overall, you have somebody who has complex psychological processing, values quality over quantity, possibly if you put it into an attitude sort of perspective. That suggests she has a good kind of coping, potential problem solving and cognitive capacities and coping abilities. On the other hand, given her situation and given all these problems, it's likely to be ruminative and problematic, where she's preoccupied and distressed and all, overwrought with fantasy and reverie that doesn't help very much and gets in the way of her functioning. So that's a little bit of putting the complexity into that picture that she has. And they're suggesting that she gets kind of carried away with her reactions and over-responds and doesn't control things very well, even with all these skills. Okay? I'm not sure if she's completely impulsive, because human movement and complexity are going to interfere with strong, overt reactions and impulsivity, but she might have fantasy or ideation or affect might be large, quite influenced by these things. But there is a lot of psychological activity. She kind of gets caught up in it too, with the ideation and the human movement response. Human movement responses are delayed, thinking things through, kind of consistent with what CS talked about, although we also look at the interpersonal component. So the first thing we come across is the Ego Impairment Index, and that's kind of elevated, okay? And that's troublesome because it's a measure of sort of like overall severity of psychopathology, severity of the illness, the amount of problematic processing. When it gets really highly elevated, it can be related to thought disorder and disturbed thinking about people and so forth, and reality problems, and schizophrenic spectrum sorts of symptoms and problems. So it's kind of elevated. A 1.3 is it's not good. It would be like equal to a 2 on the PTI, or the PTI is lower here, or the TP comp. And these don't change at all. I don't think any of that.
It's 1.4.
Yeah, what changed with that?
We took out an income.
Oh, it took out an income. Okay, so it just as the TP comp, it changes from what to what?
It's the same.
It doesn't change?
It's just 1.4.
Okay.
Ego impairment's
1.2.
And
So 1.4 and 1.2, and this
Yeah.
is the same. Okay. And so this is suggesting that her thinking might be a little bit off. And so we're kind of focused on, and they share a lot of the same characteristics, but they're weighted a little bit differently. And there's some things that are in the EII, which is a broader one. Remember, I talked about it includes content, critical content, and good to poor human. And so this would suggest that the content of her thought is different and problematic, not just the processing. So if we go down and look here, that I'm not sure that these weightings and things will be that helpful. This is kind of technical stuff, and who knows what's a big score versus a little score here. But that these are the things that make it up, okay? And the things that are really different from the EII versus the TP comp, they both have form quality Okay? And that's quite prominent with the TP comp. They both have cognitive codes. You have W sum cog on both, and FAB2 gets on that. They both have M minus. So the structural features are focused, and the sort of thought organization features and reality testing features are focused in a structural way on the TP comp. And you come over here, and the things that are really different are, number one, it corrects for the number of responses. Okay, so, and that's not a big deal in RPAS because we've constricted the range. It's much more important in comprehensive system. And that it has critical contents, and HRV are good to poor human. Okay, and and you can't really tell about those numbers what that means. But if you look here, what you'll see is the critical content is really high, and poor to good human is very high. And so that's really the difference. That this individual's reality testing and thinking processes are not great, but not too bad, with the not awful, with the 1.2 on the PTI or the TP comp, which is not good actually. They're kind of personalized and off, but they're not like at schizophrenic levels. But the big problem is all the crude content, all the blood and guts and sex responses and all the other stuff, that those primitive ideas, unmodulated, that are going to interfere with their processing. Okay? And then the second thing are these gross misunderstandings of people with the good to poor, with all the poor human representations. Let's also look at M minus to see if that's high. That might be carrying some of the weight with her. M minus on page 1. It's not. We have it under. And we have M minus under self and other representations. So there's also thoughts about people, and that's where some of the good validity is. And a 1 isn't that high. Minus 1 isn't that high, particularly in a record like this. Okay, so. So that gives us a picture of the individual. There's a lot of crude, primitive ideas that should be repressed or not part of her processing, and sublimated or disguised or modulated and not so gross. Okay. So, one other thing we didn't talk about, that her complexity at 120, that we should be thinking about also looking at the complexity adjusted scores. Okay? And see whether these scores are due to complexity or not. So if you look at her synthesis, it's 120, and when you take into consideration complexity, it's 100. So we probably wouldn't say anything special about relational thinking and that sort of stuff. We would sort of involve it in the overall characterization of complexity. And synthesis is highly related to it. But we'll check some of these other scores that you see that the EII goes down a little bit and the TP comp go down a little bit when we take into consideration complexity. Okay? And so that some of that is like a false elevation. With more complex records, you have a little bit more. The more stuff you put into, the more likely you're going to include some problematic material that comes from the complexity and not necessarily from the underlying disorder. And that hopefully that gives us a little sense of that. Now, we could do a display, and I could show you what it looks like. You can plot these things. So these are actually grayed out on what we had, but they don't look grayed out here for whatever reason. On the one on this screen, they look grayed out. And so so that if there's like a 10-point difference, something like that, then we show the complexity adjusted one here. But I think it just becomes too busy and you can't figure it out that well. So, and if the difference is, this is a 7-point difference, you don't get 2. icons for that, or 2 indicators. So you can present it like that, and that may help if you want to look at. Let's put the minimums and the maximums in there so we can look at those. So there's some funny thinking. A lot of it's got to do with the content of a thought, necessarily the process of a thought. And as we look down here, we see that W sum cog and severe cog is not elevated that much. Form quality minus is a little bit high. WD minus is low. Okay. FQ ordinary is low and they're not that great, but there's nothing really strong in any one of those indicators. It's just a little bit of personalization, of just a teeny bit of most of the form quality ordinary is a little bit low, form quality minus is a little bit up. That kind of quality, that's where it comes from. So did I turn this thing on? Yeah, thank God. The way the math works on these things, it seems to me that sometimes the EII and the PTI version of the TP comp look worse than they are in the case. It's the way the math works. But so this is not schizophrenic levels. All right. And there's 6 populars, which is pretty good. That if she had like 1 or 2 populars with all this capacity and all this going on, you would think that this rumination and preoccupation and odd thinking and crude thinking getting in the way of her being able to recognize conventionality and obvious things to do and see the obvious things that other people see in a way that's going to help her be in step with people. So having 6 populars is a good thing, and it's slightly more than the mean. So the central tendency for populars is just below 6 in terms of average. Anything on that? So we see in the distress variables, 2 of them elevated, and so overall we're going to think there's a good, some good bit of distress in the case, and that gives us sort of the ruminative, depressogenic kind of component to all this complexity. And focus on little m. Little m is associated with an experience of external stressors, or at least externalization. Feel like you're at mercy of the forces outside your control. It's a pretty similar interpretation they have in the comprehensive system. The data relates it also to stress. So little m and y are like the typical normal reaction to strong stress. And they also see it elevated in post-traumatic stress disorders and stuff. By the way, I just had published online, it's going to be in print, a Rorschach application for PTSD. Sort of a research summary and conceptual approach to doing that. If you're interested in, I could send you the link. That one's not on the RPAS stuff because it's not really an RPAS. It's a general Rorschach application to PTSD. I'd be glad to send it to you. So I think it's a good. I like it. So. Anyway, and so that 4 out of 5 are above the average. 2 of them are really sort of extreme. But some of it has to do with the complexity of the situation. But still, morbid and little m are elevated, and morbid is the one that's closest related to depression. It's not a huge. 119 isn't too. That's pretty high. 4 morbid responses is pretty high. So we have some information suggesting external stress, at least experiencing it as if the stuff's coming from the outside, at least, even if it isn't immediate, strong stress in the world, and some depressive and morbid attributions. And probably feeling damaged, injured, broken, those sorts of things. You have to consider the responses to the self-concept stuff. We go to self and other representations. By the way, without any egocentricity index, and we still score pairs, the reason we score pairs is that it's in the suicide constellation. And that's the only reason. It seems like not the greatest reason to have it. But that's why we code it in RPAS. And we may be able to get around it when you get more data so that we can have other predictors of it and you don't have to bother coding it. So, and forgetting it, like in my case. So this 5.2 is kind of like a 5.5 or something like that, or 5.8, the way that the numbers work. So it's not a bad, it's nothing to worry about, but it's a little elevated. Okay, ODL is like the average for ODL. You see here is about 10%. And she has 18%. That's an elevation. So she may, those mouth responses or whatever contribute to that. So there may be an expectation or a yearning to be kind of taken care of and psychologically fed and that sort of imagery.
Or she's bulimic and preoccupied with
Yeah,
her
so
mouth.
so that may be, so in other words, that may be a result of the bulimia in terms of the experience, or it may contribute to it, and so I deal with that in the interpretation. So we already talked about the poor MAP. She's got 2 out of 4, so that's about average. It's kind of surprising when people have 2, but that would be average sort of situation. But she has 9 out of 14 poor humans. 120, that's pretty high. And so she's going to misunderstand others, misunderstand herself, misunderstand relationships. So, in one way or another, that's not very good. She's got 1M minus. That's a bit of an elevation. I'm not sure I interpret that really strongly. Aggressive content. So there's a lot of aggressive attributions, even more than the guy who got in all the fights and stuff. Now, some of these are in the so that H and COP are in the positive direction. So there's some integrated understanding of others, and COP is a 2. So there's some cooperative sorts of things too some cooperative understandings, even if she doesn't understand people that well in general. And MAH is 2, which is high in raw score, but given these responses, it's not very high when it gets corrected with the complexity. I didn't know that score would jump so much. That's kind of surprising to me. So there is the way the test works. The more that you give, the test is going to detect more problems, and the more information the psychologists have, the more likely to say bad things about people too. So it's kind of the clinical bias that why we get into business. We're fascinated with what's wrong with people. So now we're going to go to page 2. The W plus being that high is sort of consistent with her taking on so much and being caught up in all the complexity of the stimuli, and she may have sort of high aspirations and demand a lot about herself, and we don't know the sort of weak sort of hypothesis there. DD is not really elevated. We're not going to say anything. Space integration is a little bit, but sort of that's her working hard, with the stimuli. She has one vague response. I'm not going to worry about that. Vista and FD are not that elevated, so it doesn't look like a clear sort of self-critical stance toward the self or an analytic sort of stepping back. It's just more, it's not part of it according to this data, and we should be able to see it with all this complexity. No pure C's, that's a good sign given we saw with C, all these 5 CFs or whatever. And that M passive is a little elevated, and that's thought to have to do with like passive fantasy, where she soothes herself in the fantasy rather than coming up with active, goal-oriented, striving plans and so forth. So that with this situation, it would mean that she may sort of withdraw into fantasy and soothe herself that way with the extra M passives. Form code unusual, I don't think we do much with that. The potentially problematic determinants, those are high, but it gets reduced to 100 with the complexity. So just based on the PPD and stuff, we wouldn't say she's so troubled. But in terms of critical contents, that's another kind of picture there. C prime is not that elevated. Critical contents, we already talked about that. That's the thing we have to worry about. Let's go ahead and take a look at what makes those up. So, we have one anatomy response, one blood response, 2 explosion responses, 2 fire responses, 2 sex responses, and 1 aggressive movement response and 4 morbid responses. She has a little bit of everything. It's not like it just looks like depression or somatic concerns or sexual sorts of things. She's, it seems like it's in different imagery in different places. That's all this ideational stuff is not controlled that well. And actually that picture is worse, rather, in a sense that you can't focus on one at the expense of other. The only thing that's really prominent are the morbid responses and possibly depression or feeling damaged, injured, or damaged self-concept. So that if you have like one thing that dominates, let's say there are like 8 morbid responses and 1 anatomy response, we would probably be able to say that this is more controlled. But this looks like everything that she doesn't control that well, which is a little more harder to work with and harder to understand. One thing you could also do, it's a little bit more difficult, you could go look at the poor human responses and identify what makes them poor human, like it was all aggression or all morbid or something, or form quality minus. You'd have a better idea of the specifics of her misunderstanding of people and relationships. But you have to go through the scores themselves to do that. Now, that on the one hand, like having a lot of human content and a lot of whole humans, pure H, is a good thing. This could be like some over concern, like dominates her ideation and her reverie. It's sort of like out of balance. It's almost too much. And I'm like some people, sometimes paranoid people, are like hyper alert about humans and give a lot of human responses. You see that in the vigilance composite, and so there's something a little off about that. That it's the idea that it's so divergent and so high that it's a peculiar aspect of her thinking, even though in general it's a good thing. So vigilance comp is elevated, but when you take into consideration complexity, that it's low. I'm not sure I would use a complexity adjusted approach to vigilance, because it's part of the problem with vigilance is the complexity of the thinking. So I would not be thinking that an adjustment makes sense. I'd be reading the 117 there. So there might be some, focus, cognitive effort, and looking for cues of danger, and keeping distance and focusing so that she doesn't get caught unaware, and distancing from people and thinking people are a little bit of threats and keeping your sort of interpersonal distance. So that might be going. I would think that would be going on with it. Likewise, the suicide concern composite, I'm not sure I would use it complexity adjusted there, because part of this is ruminative, being bothered and caught up with this stuff and feeling like you can't get out of it, so it's part of the problem, and you wouldn't be taking that out too. So if you notice her suicide constellation goes from like 109 to 103, I'd be reading the 109 even though it's not that high. So. Passive, active, one human movement's not a big deal. There's no T, that's not a good thing, but as we said before, it's pretty common. Personalizations, there's none. Anatomy, there's only one, which is kind of a good thing given everything else that's going on.